Napoleon by Leslie McGuire, World Leaders Past and Present series. So this is another book in the World Leaders Past and Present series. For more information about this series, see the video linked in the description down below. But essentially, it's a series of history books on world leaders published in the late 80s for, I don't know, young adults, kind of junior high school age children. This was a very brief summary of Napoleon's life aimed at the young adult audience. But the gaps in my personal historical knowledge are such that I still learned tons from it. I didn't know a lot about Napoleon before reading this. I found it fascinating reading. I hope to someday find a full-length biography of Napoleon, like a proper one for adults. But until I do find that, this one will have to do the trick. I think everyone who ever reads a biography of Napoleon comes away astounded by what he was able to accomplish, and perhaps slightly appalled by the tremendous amount of death and bloodshed that was necessary to satisfy his ambition. Considering Napoleon started out as nothing but the son of a petty Corsican noble who couldn't even speak correct French, and then later had his military career almost finished before it even started because of his association with Robespierre, what Napoleon managed to accomplish was truly amazing. He inherited a situation with France in disarray and under attack by all of Europe, and he was able to beat all of Europe back 3 out of 4 times. The Napoleonic Wars are something I didn't know about before I started this book and still don't know much about, but this book does a good job of summarizing it. It is a bit confusing though, because in a relatively short period of time, there were 4 different coalitions of European powers united against Napoleon. The scope of the Napoleonic Wars is somewhat astounding as well, raging as it did back and forth across Europe several times. It made me think of like World War I and World War II, which I know were world wars, but I think in both cases, most of the primary fighting was done in Europe, certainly in World War I. And yet we still call it a world war. So by that logic, maybe these Napoleonic Wars were world wars as well. They were certainly all European wars at least. On to a different topic. One of the things I remember from my history class at college, in which I did study Napoleon briefly, was the paradox of how Napoleon both ended the French Revolution by ending the Republic and establishing autocratic rule, but at the same time he continued the French Revolution because he cemented the advances of the French Revolution by spreading the Enlightenment code of laws and administration throughout Europe. So getting rid of the feudal systems and spreading an enlightened code of laws. This comes up in the book, particularly in the last few paragraphs, when Leslie McGuire attempts to sum up Napoleon's mixed legacy. It's interesting enough that I'll just quote the whole thing in full. So this is from the end of the book, page 106. Quote, "Some consider him, Napoleon, the enlightened bearer of revolutionary ideals. Others regard him as a forerunner of 20th century dictators. It is hard to assess his role. He withdrew the map of Europe several times. He brought lasting reforms to the legal, administrative, judicial, and educational systems of an entire continent. He revolutionized warfare. But the political and social upheavals, such as the French Revolution, that shook France and the rest of Europe, would have happened without him. Many of his actions brought unintended results. He paved the way for the unification of Italy and Germany. He helped make the United States a world power by selling the Louisiana Territory. His war with Spain gave the countries of Latin America an opportunity to fight for their independence. He strengthened the Pope and the Catholic Church, despite his attempts to do the opposite. Napoleon left behind a powerful legend that grew to enormous proportions after his death. His son, Napoleon II, never ruled France. But in 1852, his nephew, Louis Napoleon, traded on the popularity of his name to proclaim the Second Empire, and took the title Napoleon III. Bonapartism, the belief in a strong authoritarian ruler appointed by the will of the people, continued to cast its spell over French politics for years, and remains a tangible force even today. End quote. Again, all of that from page 106. Okay, I'm going to change topic here and just get into a few little nitpicks I had about the book. Nitpick number 1. On page 24, the author, Leslie McGuire, claims that, quote, as head of the Committee of Public Safety, Robespierre was responsible for the deaths of some 50,000 people during the Reign of Terror. Now, 50,000, that is a lot of people. But for whatever it's worth, this quote is different from the numbers that have been popping up in the other history books I've been reading. For example, in the book Robespierre by S.L. Carson, which I reviewed recently, he gives a figure of 2,596 people dying on the Reign of Terror. That's page 20. Danton by Frank Dyer, which I've also reviewed recently, has it as more than 2,300 people were guillotined. That's page 16 of that book. The Werewolf of Paris by Guy Endore, which, okay, granted, it's not a serious history, but it's historical fiction, and it's written by a guy who wrote a lot of historical fiction. He quotes the figure as 2,596. Which is the same one that's quoted in the S.L. Carson book on Robespierre. So either 2,300 or 2,596 seem to be the going figures. I do not know where in the world Leslie McGuire got the figure of 50,000. I don't know. Is she adding in the people killed during the Civil War that was happening at the same time as the Reign of Terror? But she doesn't say if she is. I mean, if she is it fair to blame Robespierre for that? Because that Civil War was a lot bigger than just Robespierre. I don't know. Leaving it there. Nitpick number 2. This is kind of just a note, actually. These are, again, young adult books, and so they're filled with a lot of visuals, illustrations, various captions, and then they've got quotes kind of down the side of the margin, just adding information and filling up the margin of each page. It's designed for young adults, but I enjoy it as well. You know, I've got a very short attention span, so I just love all these little tidbits of information that are, you know, popping up in the margins. A complaint, though, I wish the editors had done a better job of making sure what's in the margin lined up with the main text on each page. Because quite often the quotes in the margin is kind of spoiling what's going to happen 2 or 3 pages down. So they don't line up. And in fact, I mean, it's a history book, so I guess does the term spoilers really apply? Well, maybe. I mean, history can be like a story. Okay, final thing. Speaking of these quotes in the margins, one of them gives a very graphic portrait of Napoleon's view of the German Empire. So, quoting from the book, The empire is an old serving woman who is used to being raped by everyone. Napoleon Bonaparte speaking with reference to the German Empire. So that's one of the quotes they have in the margin of this book. Now, that, to be fair, is very illustrative. It tells you a lot about what the German Empire status was like at the beginning of the 19th century, which is ironic because at the end of the 19th century, it would be one of the major powers in Europe, but shows how different it was at the beginning of the 19th century, and it also just kind of shows the disdain Napoleon had for it. But what in the world is a quote like that doing in a young adult book, right? Especially because it's just completely superfluous. I mean, it's just one of the extra quotes they had in the margin, so you could like take that out and not lose anything. It's not my idea of a quote which would be appropriate for a young adult audience, which is the audience for this book, but whatever, it's in the book. These books, again, are pretty old. They're from the late 1980s. But I don't remember the late 1980s being especially a permissive time, so even considering they're so old, I'm surprised it's in there. Okay, that's all I've got for this one.